This is At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. I'm Gary Pounder. On today's edition of the pod, we're going to take another foray into the always exciting and fascinating world of military history, and it really couldn't come at a better time because this summer marks the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. Midway, as you probably know, one of the pivotal battles of World War II. It was literally the engagement that turned the tide of the war in the Pacific for the U.S. and Allied forces. From December of 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, up until June of 42, the Japanese were continuously on the advance in the Pacific, taking territory across the Pacific, in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia. But after Midway, the Japanese would be always on the defensive and the Americans on the offensive up until the Japanese surrendered in September of 1945. To discuss Midway and the significance of that battle, both in World War II and today, we're going to be joined by an expert on the topic. He is Dr. Timothy Orr. He's an associate professor of history at Old Dominion University in Norfolk. He has written a number of papers and publications on both the U.S. Civil War and World War II. And along with his wife, Laura, he wrote a book, kind of a memoir, one of the last surviving U.S. Navy pilots who flew at Midway, a man named Dusty Cleese, and we'll talk more about that book during the podcast. So, as we approach the 80th anniversary of the battle, a discussion on Midway. That's coming up today on At Ease. But first, a message for all you airmen and Space Force guardians out there in the audience. What does your to-do list for the rest of 2022 look like? Maybe take some time off. Maybe you're working on a new program or something like that. Maybe you're looking at transitioning out of the service. Maybe you've got other things on the agenda. Well, here's something else you might want to think about adding to your to-do list for 2022. And that is finishing your associate degree through the Community College of the Air Force. And let's face it, both the Air Force and the Space Force make it easy for you. The vast majority of the credits you need to finish that associate degree with CCAF come from basic training, tech school, and OJT. And once all that's wrapped up, the only thing you have left are those 5 general education classes that you must take with a civilian college or university. And that's kind of where we come in. Here at Thomas Nelson Community College, we are proud to be a part of something called the GEM program. GEM meaning General Education Mobile. That makes us what you might call a preferred provider of the general ed classes you need to round out and finish up your CCAF degree. At Thomas Nelson, we offer these classes completely online on flexible schedules, and they're highly affordable. No matter where you're stationed in the Air Force or the Space Force, you will receive a tuition discount, so the cost for each class is going to be well below the TA cap that your service has imposed. And again, with flexible schedules, very easy to knock out those 5 classes and finish up your CCAF. So, add one more thing to the to-do list for 2022. Finish your CCAF associate degree by taking general education classes at Thomas Nelson Community College. If you want more information, we have one number now for all military students. That number is 757-825-3442. You can also visit us online at tncc.edu/military. Finishing up your CCAF in 2022? Well, it's easier than you think at Thomas Nelson, becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College. As we mentioned during the intro a moment ago, today on At Ease, we're going to be focusing on one of the pivotal battles of World War II, that being the Battle of Midway. The 80th anniversary of Midway is coming up next month. And as I said during the intro, if you ask military historians for a short list of the most important engagements in World War II, Midway almost inevitably makes the list. And to discuss the legacy of the Battle of Midway, we're joined today by Dr. Timothy Orr. He is an associate professor of history at Old Dominion University in Norfolk. He is a noted expert both on the U.S. Civil War and on World War II, specifically the Battle of Midway. In fact, Dr. Orr and his wife Laura authored a book on one of the legendary Navy dive bomber pilots who participated in that engagement, a man named Dusty Cleese. We'll talk more about Captain Cleese and his role in the battle in just a moment. But first of all, Dr. Orr, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join us here on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
And I should point out, too, that you have impeccable credentials as a historian, undergraduate degree at Gettysburg College, which I think would be a great place to learn about American history, especially the Civil War, and also your master's and PhD from a very fine graduate program in history at Penn State. But let's get into Midway this morning. And Midway is something that most Americans have some general idea about. It's covered in all the history textbooks, but I think that many of us, especially Americans who are a bit younger, may not really grasp the significance of the Battle of Midway. So for someone, again, who may be a bit younger, who's just learned the bare basics of Midway in World War II, how would you sum up the battle? What is the importance of Midway to not only the U.S., but the Allied war effort in World War II?
Well, I'd sum it up as sort of a momentum shift in the way the war was going in the Pacific, because up until that point in June of 1942, Japanese naval, air, and land forces were undergoing a tour de force across the Western Pacific, taking all the major Allied possessions. And, most notably, they had captured a huge American and Filipino army in the Philippines, one of the greatest military disasters the U.S. ever suffers in its history. And everything looked very dark for the U.S. and the other allies at that point until the Battle of Midway intervenes. The U.S. forces in the Pacific sink 4 Japanese carriers in a single day's action, and it stops the Japanese offensive across the Pacific right there at the international date line. And it gives the Allies a chance to kind of pause, mobilize their forces, and then shift the balance the other way and make their offensive across the Pacific, slowly reducing the Japanese empire. So the best way to kind of say it, it's like, if we could use a football analogy, the Japanese are kind of at 5th in the goal line, and then they fumble and the Allies take it and then draw it back the other way. So the eventual downfall of Japan kind of begins in June of 1942, and that's its importance. Now, I would add one kind of small bit, is that it's also kind of a revolutionary moment for the aircraft carrier, because at that point, people were not entirely certain of whether naval aircraft were going to be the cat's meow of naval technology. It hadn't yet been proven, and aircraft carrier tactics really kind of shines here. And one of the reasons that aircraft carrier task forces are the centerpiece of the U.S. Navy today is because of what happened at Midway.
And you mentioned the early history of World War II after Pearl Harbor, the fact the Japanese were running wild across the Pacific, and at some point there they seemed virtually unstoppable. But there are a couple of events that happened in April of 1942 I'd like for you to talk about that kind of lay the foundation for the Battle of Midway. I'm talking about, first of all, the Doolittle raid, where U.S. aircraft, actually Army Air Corps B-25s launched from the carrier Hornet, strike targets in Japan, and then followed by that, toward the end of the month, the Battle of the Coral Sea. How did the Doolittle raid and Coral Sea kind of set the stage for Midway?
Yeah, so what the Doolittle raid is, for the uninitiated, it is this kind of Hail Mary raid done by U.S. Army Air Corps bombers, 16 of them that are put on the USS Hornet, which is one of a Yorktown-class aircraft carriers that is part of the Pacific Fleet at that time. And the purpose is to bomb Tokyo. And mostly, in my opinion, it's kind of a effort to gin up kind of American war spirit, because these bombers kind of knew that they weren't going to do any kind of major damage to Japanese industry, but they launch off of a carrier flight deck in the midst of choppy seas, and they make a one-way trip. They fly to Tokyo, they drop bombs on several steel plants, and then their next step is to fly farther east into occupied China and try to make landings at various Chinese air bases there. And for the Japanese, this is kind of a shocking moment for them because they did not expect to be hit on their home islands from the Americans so early in the war. So there's kind of a effort by the Japanese propaganda machine to really kind of churn up anger at what went on. They kind of make the case that this is the Americans committing war crimes by bombing civilian targets. Of course, noticeably turning a blind eye to their own war crimes in China that they had committed in 1937. But the idea is that it really steps up the planned attempt to take out Midway Atoll, which is an American base that is right in the center of the Pacific. Now, just to make it clear, the Doolittle raid doesn't prompt the Japanese to do this. They had plans to take Midway a few weeks earlier. They'd already kind of put together that operation. But this attack on the Japanese homeland speeds it up. And part of the reason that it speeds it up is because the Japanese can't quite wrap their heads around this idea that Americans have somehow launched Army bombers off the deck of a carrier. So they have really no idea from where these Army bombers came. So they're trying to put together all the possibilities. And one possibility is somehow the Americans stripped down these bombers, got enough fuel on board that they actually launched off of Midway. And they know it's an unlikely possibility, but just in case that was what happened, they have to knock out this American base. So therefore, that operation is pushed to the front, and the Japanese make their attempt to take it in early June of 1942. And your other question is the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is kind of famously the very first battle where carrier task groups fight each other, and the two opposing navies never come within sight of each other. And this is fought during the first week of May 1942, from the 4th of May to the 8th of May 1942. And the purpose of this battle, for the Japanese, it is an attempt to get at a crucial port called Port Moresby. They want to have a land operation there, and the only way that they can do that is if they clear the Coral Sea out of all Allied forces. And the Coral Sea, for people who don't know, it's on the northeast coast of Australia. So there's a bunch of Australian naval forces there, and if they kind of wipe out those ships, then Japanese land forces will take Port Moresby, put them in a great position to make raids into the South Pacific. And for the Americans, it is all about keeping open their lifeline between Hawaii and Australia. Their strongest ally there is Australia, and if they lose the Coral Sea, then they are going to lose the connection to their strongest ally. So they have to kind of go in, deal with the Japanese, and there's sort of an a fight that really neither side technically wins. The Americans lose an aircraft carrier there, the USS Lexington, which is a heavy blow. The Japanese lose a light carrier there called the Shoho, but neither side really walks away as the tactical victor. But the Americans do stop the raid on Port Moresby, which is the most important outcome of that operation. And so this battle, kind of this set piece between two aircraft carrier fleets, really kind of impresses upon the Japanese the need to destroy the American carriers as soon as possible, because that is their biggest threat to their conquest of the Pacific, because those American carriers can be pretty dangerous when they are used the right way.
And obviously the Japanese now, after Coral Sea and after the other events that have taken place so far, and having failed to eliminate the American carriers at Pearl Harbor because the carriers were out of port when the Japanese attacked, while their plan is to go and take Midway and then potentially use that as a staging base for attacks, perhaps again against Hawaii, maybe even the U.S. West Coast, they also see Midway as an opportunity to lure out the American carrier force and destroy it. And I'm sure that was one of their objectives going into the Midway engagement.
Yeah, that is their main objective, right? Because they feel like their biggest missed opportunity from the Pearl Harbor raid was allowing the American carriers to survive it. Of course, not their fault, because they didn't realize the American carriers were going to be on other missions at the time. The attack on December 7th occurred. So the only way to get the Americans to engage in a carrier battle, just like the Coral Sea, was to lure them out, exactly as you said. And a raid on Midway was sure to do that, because the Japanese had been kind of successful in taking another American base a few months earlier at Wake Island, and the surrender of the Marine Corps garrison there really set up a stir among the American public that no one had come out to rescue the Marine defenders of Wake. So if Midway were under siege the same way, almost certainly there would be a response from the Americans to send out their carriers. And so the plan for the Japanese was to ambush them as they came west from Pearl Harbor towards Midway, which they hoped at that time they would have already secured. So that's kind of their main purpose, to deal with the American carriers. And then their secondary purpose is exactly like you said. If they repurpose Midway, it could be a good staging area for an attack on Hawaii. Because Japanese strategy at that point is kind of contingent on the fact that they know they can't overwhelm the United States. That is never part of their goal. But they want to get into a situation where they can negotiate a peaceful settlement that is in their best interest, which means keeping the stuff that they have already taken, like the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. And so if they can convince the Americans that a fight across the Pacific will be a waste of lives and a waste of their time, then they can win the peace at the negotiating table. And they're sort of on a time clock to do that, because Japanese oil supplies are going to run dry by 1944. They know it. So the only thing that they can really do is try to win a big, decisive battle as soon as possible.
And we should point out, too, the Japanese naval doctrine had been based on the decisive battle theory for some time, going back really perhaps even before the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, when the Japanese fleets decisively defeated the Tsar's fleet, which literally sailed around the world to engage the Japanese. Now, we should also point out that in any military conflict, any battle, intelligence is going to play a very important role. Now, first of all, from the Japanese side, after Coral Sea, they knew they had sunk one of our fleet carriers, the USS Lexington. Didn't they also believe that they had sunk a second carrier, the USS Yorktown? So what kind of response were the Japanese anticipating the U.S. would be able to make when they made their strike against Midway?
Yeah, so the Americans have, prior to the Coral Sea, 5 operational fleet carriers. The 2 older ones, the Lexington and the Saratoga, and the 3 new Yorktowns, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet. As you mentioned, Lexington is sunk at Coral Sea. The Saratoga had been torpedoed back in January of 1942, so it was laid up for repairs on the West Coast. So the Japanese believed that there were only 3 American carriers operational, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet. And as you suggest, they also thought that they had perhaps either damaged Yorktown or sunk it at the Coral Sea, because it suffers 1 bomb strike. So they were not expecting that the Yorktown would be present for combat operations in June 1942. And so they thought they had a pretty good chance of beating whatever the U.S. would send after them, because at most it would be the Hornet and the Enterprise. And they even weren't too knowledgeable about the existence of the Hornet, even though it was the one that launched the Doolittle raid. The Japanese didn't know much about its redeployment to the Pacific, which had just occurred in March of 1942. So they were thinking that the American response from the carriers would be a tepid one at best.
And they were thinking, too, that the U.S. perhaps would not be willing to really commit all of their forces and risk the potential destruction of what the Japanese thought were the only 2 available carriers there in the Pacific. So they could perhaps brush aside the U.S. task force, send the amphibious force in, go ahead and take Midway and secure that base. But again, they were mistaken. Now, we should point out, and you mentioned this a moment ago, Yorktown did suffer a serious bomb hit from a Japanese aircraft at Coral Sea, and it had to literally limp its way back across to Pearl Harbor. And I believe as they were approaching Pearl, they told Admiral Nimitz, who was the sink pack, they thought the Yorktown would need something like 3 months in dry dock to fix the damage repairs. And Nimitz basically said, I'll give you, I think it's 42 or 72 hours to have her patched up and ready to go back to sea. And we were able to achieve that. Now, getting back to the intelligence discussion we were on a moment ago, the U.S. obviously did have an intelligence advantage going into Midway. Talk about the role that U.S. and Allied code breakers played in helping us decipher and determine what the Japanese were going to do, and being able to definitively say that, yes, Midway is going to be their next target.
Yeah, and this is critical to why there is a battle at all, because if the Americans had not cracked the Japanese naval code, they may not have even responded to the Japanese move towards Midway. And the way that it is cracked is because there is an intelligent cryptanalyst unit that is stationed in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, called Station Hypo. It is run by a very intense naval officer named Commander Joseph Rochefort. And Rochefort is kind of the cutting edge of Navy cryptanalysis. And so the Japanese have this very, very complex code called JN25B. It is the way that they transmit messages, and it's without getting too deep into the weeds here, it's a series of ciphers that you have to do. You have these 5-digit code sequences, and you have to change it twice on 2 ciphers and then translate it from Japanese into the English language. And it takes some time to do that, right? And you got to find a way to decode all these numbers. And that is being done feverishly by Rochefort and his team. And they're able to uncover enough of the Japanese naval code and also kind of learn kind of the traditions and the techniques of the Japanese code senders, right? That they can actually pretty accurately determine that Midway is going to be the next target. They know exactly the day that it's going to be struck, June the 4th. They know which Japanese ships are going to be involved in the operation. And so they can predict the next Japanese move with pretty good certainty. Now, it takes some convincing because, Navy cryptanalysis at that time is largely based on having a solid read, a fully deciphered document. But Rochefort is more of the mind that you can never be certain with enemy transmissions that are decoded. You have to sort of interpret and fill in the blanks, because not every sentence, not every word is decoded. You just got to fill in from the context. And so he gives this information to Admiral Nimitz. There's a famous meeting where Rochefort shows up 20 minutes late to it because he's trying to decode the last little bits. And he has all these papers in his hand, and he gives it to Nimitz, and it says, this is how we are certain that it's going to be Midway. And Nimitz makes the decision, rather than abandon Midway, which is something he could do. He could try to get all the Marines and naval officers off the atoll. He decides instead to defend it, because he thinks the advantage we have here is that we know the enemy are coming, and the enemy does not know that. So instead of this being a battle where the Japanese ambush us, we are going to ambush them. And that advantage is crucial to winning the battle.
And there's a famous anecdote going back to Commander Rochefort and his team a moment ago. As you point out, and this is a very important distinction, we had cracked the Japanese code up to a point, as you point out, we were not deciphering everything, so we're having to use analysis, just old-fashioned interpretation to kind of fill in the gaps. So they're about, I guess, 90% sure, Rochefort and his team are, that Midway is going to be the target. There is disagreement. ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, is convinced it may be another target. So there's this debate going back and forth. So Rochefort developed this rather clever ruse to get the Japanese to reveal that Midway is, in fact, going to be their target. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so the Japanese coded every island or body of water in the Pacific with 2 letters, and Midway was coded target AF, right? A always stood for American. If it was an American-held thing, it began with A, and the second letter was just another random letter. Now, Rochefort, he knew that Midway was target AF as early as March of 1942 because they intercepted transmission from a lost Japanese seaplane that mentions being near target AF. And the only trajectory that could have been was Midway. And so Rochefort was convinced of that was how he knew it, target AF was Midway. And if the Japanese are talking about attacking target AF in June, that's how he makes the connection. But his bosses in Washington that are part of this other unit called Op 20G, they're not so convinced. And, Rochefort, he's listened to by many of the people in Pearl Harbor, particularly Nimitz, and then his very talented chief of intelligence, Edwin Layton. But they're not going to give Nimitz the go-ahead unless they convince the guys in Washington. So the ruse is that they're going to send a message to Midway via underground cable that has to be transmitted from Midway that says that they are having trouble with their freshwater condenser, which is a bit of information the Japanese need to know, because if they're going to occupy the island, they need to pack extra fresh water for their troops. So that is transmitted. So obviously it's a bogus message, but then the listening post at Kwajalein hears that message and they transmit it to high command. Target AF having trouble with freshwater condenser, and the Japanese, of course, have to make the changes in it all. But then once that code is then picked up by the Americans at Station Hypo, they have undeniable proof that Target AF is Midway. And again, I don't think it was ever a matter of Rochefort being convinced of it, or even Nimitz being convinced of it, but of convincing the people in Washington who were his biggest doubters. And so that was just redemptive confirmation, I think, on his part.
And at that point, we have the conclusive evidence that we need, and that allows Nimitz to dispatch his carrier task forces to ambush the Japanese. They would gather at a place optimistically called Point Luck off of Midway. But we should point out that as we're going into this battle, Nimitz is going to be without arguably one of his best carrier task force commanders, that being Admiral William Bull Halsey. Halsey's sideline, talk about that, and then who is picked to take his place and actually lead a carrier task force at Midway, despite the fact that this other officer has no experience in commanding carriers.
Yeah, so Admiral Halsey, who is arguably considered like the best carrier tactics commander in the U.S. fleet, is sidelined with this life-threatening skin condition that he gets on the return trip from the Coral Sea. His task force was sent out to the Coral Sea, arrives too late to be of any use to the battle on the American side, but then on the way back, he has a skin condition, so he's hospitalized, laid up until the fall. So the replacement that Nimitz ultimately selects is a cruiser skipper named Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. And Spruance is what's called a black shoe. The naval officers in these days are kind of divided whether they are surface or air power, and it's the nicknames that are given to each are based on the color of their shoe. Black if you're surface, russet brown if you're aviator, so black shoe and brown shoe. And aviators hate the idea of having a black shoe carrier commander because he doesn't know their tactics, doesn't know how to use them, and it seems like a risky choice. But I think one of the reasons that Raymond Spruance is selected to lead Task Force 16, which is Halsey's task force, is that, number one, Halsey endorses him. Like he finds him to be a very amiable officer, but also that Spruance is a very cautious commander. And so with all the risk that Nimitz is about to make in putting the three remaining carriers out into the center of the ocean, he wants to have a man in charge who is not going to extend that risk needlessly and then waste this opportunity. And further, Spruance is a very easygoing guy. He's very quiet, keeps to himself, kind of an introverted character. And, famously, he would walk the ship all the time. He did a lot of exercise on the ship, and it was impossible for his staff to keep up with him. But many of the other officers that were admiral's rank in the Navy were kind of knee people, which makes it a very difficult group to work with. But Nimitz, he really liked the kind of quieter personalities. So I think he said, let's give Spruance a chance. And it proved wise because he helps win the battle.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the distinction there between the black shoe officers, the surface warfare officers, and the aviators, the brown shoes. And in fact, we had two black shoe admirals, Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, leading the carrier task forces at Midway. Now, they obviously have very competent and qualified aviators who were there to advise them and give them advice and everything, which obviously worked out very well. But let's talk now the U.S. Carriers, the three of them, the Enterprise, the Yorktown, the Hornet, they sortie from Yorktown, heading to Point Luck off of Midway. What is generally the U.S. battle plan? What do they want to do, in terms of intercepting the Japanese when they make contact with them in the battle that is now looming?
Yeah, so my opinion of the battle plan, which is largely put together by the other task force commander, Admiral Fletcher, is that it is overly ambitious and a little bit too complicated. So the plan is, in general, to launch the air groups from all three carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, Hornet, try to get them into one big swarm. This would be like all their carrier squadrons, about 160 planes, and then send them roughly southwest from Point Luck. And the plan is to intercept the Japanese fleet as it is heading towards Midway. So the Japanese, they make the first move of the battle. They launch a big airstrike of 108 planes. They strike Midway, and then they have to maintain that course heading so they can recover those planes. And that recovery is going to be completed about like 9:15 in the morning. And Fletcher's assumption is that all you have to do to intercept the Japanese fleet is fly ahead of it, so that as the Japanese proceed towards Midway, you'll intercept them, and the flight will be at most 2 hours in length, outbound, right? But that's a ridiculous assumption in my opinion, because the Japanese do what any normal group would do. Once you've recovered your planes, you're going to change direction and turn away from Midway, so your movements aren't predicted. But for some reason, this idea escapes Fletcher, and he sends his air groups out to basically empty ocean, and imperils their lives, in my opinion, because I think any other task force commander would have said, maybe we should assume that they're going to change direction and widen our search. There's two or three other problems with Fletcher's plan, in my opinion, that are also worth mentioning. Is that, number one, he also assumes that getting all three air groups together is going to be an easy thing, right? Amassing 160 planes will be simple, but it is not. It takes hours to get all these planes in the air, handle the planes from the hangar deck to the flight deck and then launch them. And furthermore, Fletcher makes a very unwise decision at the last minute, where he launches one of Yorktown's scouting squadrons, Scouting Squadron 5, on this reconnaissance mission to the north that delays the launch of Yorktown's air group by more than an hour. And so Yorktown won't even be a part of the massive airstrike at the last minute. He tells Spruance this and says, just launch Enterprise and Hornet and send them off together as soon as possible. But then Spruance kind of delays for like 40 minutes, assuming that Yorktown will catch up. It never happens. So there's a complication from Spruance. And then finally, the other big problem that the Americans suffer from is that all of their aircraft fly at different speeds and at different altitudes. They have fighter aircraft, they have torpedo bombers that are at low altitude, and they have dive bombers that are up at high altitude. And it's impossible to get all these different squadrons moving in the same direction, and certainly not at the same altitudes. They all lose sight of each other. And some squadrons burn up about 50 minutes worth of fuel before leaving. And so the idea that Fletcher has of having a giant joint combined strike, all three carriers, all their squadrons together, it just falls apart right from the outset. And I think is one of the biggest mistakes of this battle is his overly ambitious plan that nearly loses it for the Americans, in my opinion.
And we should point out, too, we were discussing earlier the fact that Admiral Spruance, again, Black Shoe Admiral, had no real experience leading carriers. He inherits a chief of staff from Halsey, a very competent, although a very feisty aviator named Miles Browning. Browning probably had more enemies in the Navy than he had friends, but there was no doubting his tactical brilliance. So while Fletcher, like you said, has this ambitious plan for a coordinated strike from all three carriers at the same time, Browning is really bending Spruance's ear and urging him to launch as early as possible, whereas Spruance wanted to wait until the two fleets were within 100 miles of each other, so which would give, I guess, his planes more time over target, because as you mentioned earlier, and it's probably a good point to discuss very briefly here, the types of aircraft that the U.S. Navy was using in its carrier air groups in 1942. As I understand it, each air group basically had four squadrons, one squadron of F-4F Grumman Wildcat fighters, two squadrons of Dauntless SBD dive bombers, and one squadron of Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers, the low-altitude attackers you mentioned there a moment ago, which unfortunately for the pilots and crews were hopelessly obsolete by the time Midway rolls around in 1942. And the idea was that typically the fighters, dive bombers would go in high, torpedo bombers would go in low to launch torpedo attacks, and between the two attacking elements there, you would hopefully score hits on the Japanese ships that you were going after. So talk a bit about the equipment and, again, how the attack unfolds after all the problems that you were discussing a moment ago.
Yeah, let's kind of start with the planes themselves. So, again, there's three basic types. The SBDs, the dive bombers, are arguably the best of the three. They're a very highly rated plane. The pilots love them. It had been introduced to the fleet back in 1940, and it was at that time the preeminent dive bomber. And it's a precision aircraft. The idea is that you start up at about 4 miles above the target, and then you nose the plane over and you plummet downward, almost straight down, about 80 degrees. And you're supposed to release the payload, the bombs that you have either under the fuselage or under the wing, at a very low altitude, about 1,500 to 2,000 feet. And that way the ship that you're targeting is not going to dodge out of the way. And to do that, like a crazy roller coaster ride that goes about 275 miles an hour and pull out, that is going to incur about 8 or 9 G's worth of stress on the plane and the pilot. And so it's a very well-made plane. You can turn it, you can roll it as you're diving, and you can make that pull out without hitting the ocean. And so that's why it is a very effective plane, and it has really good armament, both in front in the nose and then the rear facing 30 caliber machine guns. So it's in my opinion, the most heroic piece of machinery that is used at the battle. The American fighter plane, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, is also pretty good. It is a little bit troublesome in that it is not near as good at turning or have as high a top speed as any of the Japanese fighters, the A6M0. But it is very well armored, so it can take a few hits. The only problem with it is a very short range in terms of its gas, particularly the new model, which is called the F-4F Mark IV, which is introduced right before Midway. It has these folding wings, so you can store it properly, but they put in extra machine guns in the wings that made it heavier, and therefore it consumed more fuel at a greater rate, and something I don't think the designers of that plane really quite understood until it was sent out into the field. But then the worst plane is the TBD Devastator. It's the American torpedo bomber. Normally it's a 3-seat plane, but for torpedo operations, there was just 2 people in it, a pilot and a rear seat gunner. And it carried a big 2,000-pound torpedo that you're supposed to drop when you get close to a ship, and that torpedo is supposed to track and then hit below the water line and sink the thing. Now, it's an old plane. It had been introduced back in 1937, so it's getting near the end of its lifetime. But I argue the plane itself is not the biggest problem with it. It's really the torpedo that it carries, the Mark 13 aerial torpedo. This is a weapon that has not really been combat tested. It's a very expensive weapon, and the Navy never really liked to live fire the thing in times of peace. Infamously, in the gunnery test of 1940, Torpedo Squadron 6, which is one of the torpedo squadrons that is annihilated at Midway, its gunnery test was to drop 10 torpedoes, live torpedoes, at targets that were out in a very shallow bay. They dropped these 10 torpedoes, 9 of them misfired. So there was a 90% misfire rate. And you would think that the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance would have just put the brakes on the torpedo production system and then said, hey, maybe we should rethink this. But they didn't. They kept using these torpedoes. And during the early raids of the Pacific War, there are torpedo raids at the Marshall Islands, at Huon Gulf, and then later on at Coral Sea. it doesn't really appear that many American torpedoes, if any of them, explode. They're dropped into the water and they either chase their tail, sink to the bottom, or they actually hit the side of a Japanese ship and then just don't explode because the detonator is a dud. So these torpedoes that don't go off are troublesome. And the Navy, rather than pull the plane or the weapon entirely from the fleet, their advice to the pilots is just fly slower, right, and straighter, just above stalling speed, which is about 90 knots or so. And that is just a recipe for disaster, especially if you don't have fighter cover. If you're flying straight and fast, and they say you have to get within 500 yards of the target before you drop the torpedo, of course you're going to get shot down. And so it's the tactics that are implemented to try to make this defective weapon work end up getting a great many American torpedo pilots killed. And out of 100 torpedo crewmen that are sent out on the morning mission of June 4th, 84 of them do not come back. 84% losses in the torpedo squadrons. That is horrific.
And we should point out, too, that the torpedo problems with the U.S. Navy in World War II were widespread. The U.S. submarine fleet at the same time experiencing very similar problems. Torpedoes that don't track, that just simply sink to the bottom of the ocean, or they actually hit the target and don't detonate. Submarine commanders were complaining. Obviously, air crew were complaining, folks in the torpedo bomber squadrons. And like you said, the Bureau of Ordnance just simply didn't listen. And as a result, not only did the torpedo crews pay such a heavy price at Midway, but the U.S. never really got the torpedo problem, I guess for lack of a better word, figured out or fixed until about 1943. So, again, with that in mind, let's talk about the Americans launching the initial attack on the morning of June 4th, 1942. Admiral Fletcher's concept of this grand coordinated strike by all three carriers never really transpires. And we should point out, kind of the Hampton Roads connection here, that two of the American carriers at Midway had actually been based here in Norfolk until December of 1941, the USS Yorktown, the USS Hornet. So many of the men who crewed the ship, who manned the planes, had actually been living here in Southeast Virginia before Pearl Harbor. So there was very definitely a Hampton Roads connection in the Battle of Midway.
Yeah, that's exactly true. There's a really great account from a Hornet dive bomber pilot named Clayton Fisher. When his carrier, the Hornet, is finally deployed, is sent to the Pacific. It has to, of course, leave from Norfolk in March of 1942 for its famous mission to go pick up the Doolittle Raiders. Fisher is engaged to this nurse, right? And he wants to marry her as quick as possible, so in case he's killed, she can get the benefits. And so he's got to try to rush the wedding as quick as he can. And he finds out that Virginia has a very horrible Jim Crow era law that requires genetic research on both the marital participants, because Virginia had this anti-miscegenation law that was done by a bunch of white supremacists, and he didn't have time to research his genealogy and his fiance's genealogy, so they had to borrow a car, drive on down to North Carolina where no such law existed, get their shotgun wedding, and then drive back to Norfolk, and just in time for him to kiss her goodbye, get on the Hornet and leave. So that is how long they were here in Norfolk for the USS Hornet, just a few months before the battle began.
So getting back to the attack on that morning of 4 June 1942 by U.S. forces, we have the launch of the aircraft from the Enterprise in Yorktown. We also have the Hornet launching their attack force as well. Now let's talk about Hornet for a second. The air group commander on USS Hornet was a man named Commander Stanhope Ring, who had had a very distinguished Navy career up until that point. And he has his own idea about how they're going to employ the force this morning, and he's backed up by the Hornet's skipper, a very experienced naval aviator named Mark Mitcher. And there's some disagreement among the squadron commanders on the Hornet on exactly how the strike package should proceed in terms of what heading they should fly to intercept the Japanese fleet. So Talk, if you would, Dr. Wara, a bit about Stanhope Ring and his leadership, and also this flight path that's eventually directed for the Hornet carrier group.
Yeah, and I would also add there's also disagreement among the historians about which path they take. So Stanhope Ring was British. I think he actually done some time in the Royal Navy before he joined the U.S., and he was kind of very stodgy and not very well liked by the other aviators in his air group. He was known not affectionately as the Sea Hag because the name for the Hornet Air Group commander was CHAG, Commander Hornet Air Group, which is pronounced phonetically was Sea Hag. And yeah, there was disagreement between him and his squadron commanders about the route that they should take to find the Japanese. And in fact, just 15 minutes after the whole air group takes off, and I would actually argue of all the air groups, Hornets is probably the most coordinated, at least initially. But they're 15 minutes into the flight, and then the Torpedo Squadron 8, breaks off. And the squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, believes that Ring's path that he is taking is the incorrect one. And it's a very unprofessional moment because you're supposed to follow the orders of your air group commander, but this one squadron commander goes rogue, and Ring has to get on the radio and break radio silence, which you're not supposed to do in a combat operation. He's like, what the hell are you doing? And Waldron is like, I'm going to find the Japanese fleet. You guys are going the wrong way. And Ring yells at him, get back in formation. Doesn't happen. And Waldron's history has proved that he was the one who was right. His squadron is the very first of the carrier squadrons to find the Japanese fleet. And they're all wiped out, all 15 planes shot down, only one man survives. And then all the other planes in the Hornet Air Group, the remaining 44 of them, they find nothing. Very sadly, all 10 fighter planes that are with that group, none of them make it back to the fleet. And 2 of the men in the fighter planes are never seen again. So they're lost at sea for no purpose. And they
went into sea because they literally ran out of fuel.
Yeah. And Ring nearly lost his dive bomber squadron, bombing squadron 8, to the same problem, fuel exhaustion. But luckily, those planes were able to divert to Midway. 3 of them don't make it. They crash near Midway, but the pilots and gunners are rescued by PT boats, though they are fired upon by the Midway garrison who think they're another Japanese attack. Luckily, no one is killed. So this is a devastating day for Hornet. They launched 4 squadrons. Only one squadron, Scouting Squadron 8, makes it back to the Hornet, right? And 3 of the squadrons don't find any enemy carriers. It was a terrible morning mission, and Ring was probably the one who was mostly blamed by the pilots for what went on. Whether that is true, this is where the historians disagree, because this is known as infamously as the flight to nowhere, because it went nowhere. Now, the disagreement among historians, and I should point this out, is which direction did they go? Now, back in the 1960s, the very first historian to study the Battle of Midway was a very talented writer named Walter Lord. He was in charge of this $1 million project called the Battle of Midway Project, where he interviewed veterans of the battle, which again, only 20 years later. And his conclusion was that the Hornet Air Group went southwest between the Japanese carrier force and Midway. And so they missed by simply going too far south. But then in the 1970s, there was another historian named Bowen Weishaupt. Weishaupt did some different kind of research, but his conclusion was that the Hornet Air Group missed by going north of the Japanese fleet. They went more straight west, and that's why that they ended up in this flight to nowhere. And and the reason that this is important is because it is determining upon who you blame for this disaster. Because if you believe Walter Lord's theory, then you have to blame Fletcher, Markovicher, and Spruance for sending them southwest, because that was the plan, right? But if you take Bowen Weishaupt's theory, then you're blaming Ring himself for not reading his compass correctly, because he didn't follow the procedure the admirals gave him.
Sure. To follow up on this very briefly here, Mr. Weishaupt was a Marine Corps navigator instructor in World War II. He had learned long-range navigation from a legendary instructor at Annapolis, even though he was not an Annapolis grad. And one of the fighter pilots who ran out of fuel, ditched, and then disappeared on the way back from this flight to nowhere was actually one of his fraternity brothers. He was asked to sit on a foundation established in the pilot's memory by his father, and at a meeting he happens to notice a $10 bill in a frame on the wall, and he notices that there are coordinates written on the $10 bill. And in doing some digging, again, being an experienced navigator, he recognized very quickly that this was, I think it's called a snort sifter or something like that. If you're a pilot who's rescued by a rescue aircraft, naval tradition says you give the pilot of the rescue aircraft the biggest bill you have in your wallet at the time. This Navy pilot who was picked up from the Hornet Air Group by a PBY flying boat, biggest bill he had, probably water-soaked, was a $10 bill. And the pilot of the PBY writes down the coordinates of where he picked this pilot up at. And Mr. Weishaupt, again, being an experienced navigator, looks at the rescue point and realizes that for this pilot having flown out, on this so-called flight to nowhere, then trying to get back to the Hornet, where he ditched and was picked up, he was much too far north to have ever flown a southwesterly heading, and that's how Mr. Weishaupt hit upon the theory that, again, the Hornet Air Group, instead of flying southwest, as their after-action report indicated, had flown an almost due westerly heading, something approaching, 270 degrees, and of course that would have put them well north of the Japanese formation. For you, as a World War II historian, who do you think is closer to being right? Is it Walter Lord's theory that the Hornet Air Group simply flew too far south to intercept the Japanese, with the exception of Torpedo 8? Or do you think Mr. Weishaupt was correct in the sense that the Hornet Group, flying due west, simply flew too far north to potentially intercept the Japanese fleet?
Yeah, this is a good question. And it's one that I've debated with people countless times. And I'm sort of in the minority on this. I generally think that the Walter Lord theory is a little bit stronger than the Bowen-Weishaupt theory. And I say this on your podcast knowing I'm going to get some feisty emails from people who are going to listen to it and disagree with me. I always say that in the end, it really doesn't matter which direction they went, because in the end, they don't find anything regardless, right? But of course, it does matter, again, who bears the blame for it, right? So Weishaupt's theory has a number of things going for it. Most notably, the bulk of the veteran pilots from the Hornet Air Group agreed with it, right? After that theory came out, they were like, oh yeah, it was all Ring's fault, right? But the problem is whether or not they have sort of rose-colored glasses about it. They hated Ring already, so naturally it was easy for them to blame him for failing to read his compass. The problem is with Weishaupt's theory, and I don't want to go, again, too detailed here because I could go for hours on it. There are some big flaws that are tough to swallow. Number one is that $10 bill, the short snorter that you talked about, whether those coordinates are accurate, right? Because they're put on in remembrance of this event. And they could not, it's possible that they weren't remembered correctly by the PBY pilot who wrote them. It's possible that they were correct as he remembered them, but it wasn't correct where he was picked up, because the PBY pilots at Midway were notorious for giving out incorrect information. And then finally is the sea drift. When you're on a raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for 4 or 5 days, wind and waves can blow you really far off course. And so where you are picked up by a PBY, I don't think has any determination on where the Hornet Air Group actually flew. And then there's also the problem of another issue, which is Fighting Squadron 6. This is the fighting squadron from Enterprise. And we know that this squadron follows Torpedo Squadron 8 to its target, right? It picks up when Waldron breaks off, mistakenly thinking that Waldron's squadron is Torpedo Squadron 6. And then famously, Fighting Squadron 6 does nothing. They kind of watch the battle occur, and then they have to turn around when they run out of fuel. So if this is true, if Fighting Squadron 6 picked up the trail of Torpedo Squadron 8, that meant that the Hornet Air Group started out by going southwest. Because if they were going due west, there's no way that Fighting Squadron 6 could have seen Torpedo Squadron 8, because they would be approaching each other from opposite directions rather than following each other. So geographically, that theory kind of makes no sense to me. And the final thing is, in the 1950s, Wade McCluskey was interviewed about this. And he kind of had, again, the Walter Lord theory before Walter Lord had it. He said, listen, Hornet and Enterprise both went on the same heading to the southwest. And when we got to that spot where Fletcher thought we would find the enemy force, I chose to go to the starboard side because I thought the Japanese would have slowed up their move towards Midway, so we had to go right. Ring got to the same area a bit later than I did, and he chose to go left towards Midway, thinking the Japanese had speeded up rather than slowed down. And his explanation for things was that it was just the instinct that we did, which direction we wanted to go to widen the search. And I generally think that McCluskey was a guy who knew what the heck was going on at that battle, so I would follow his lead. And one final bit is that the Hornet Air Group we don't actually know what the Hornet Air Group after action report said, because it was lost when the Hornet was lost at the Battle of Santa Cruz. So that's the great mystery of this, is if we had the after action reports, what Ring actually wrote up. We have like some post-war letter of his that is a little bit suspicious, but the actual official thing that was written up in June 1942, we do not have. If anyone out there in internet land knows where it is, by all means, tell me, because I would love to see it. So I don't necessarily dismiss Bowen Weisheit's theory, but I always look on people who uniformly support it with a raised eyebrow, because they have to try to deal with those troublesome plot holes in it in order to make it make sense to me.
And we should point out, too, in fairness to those who were there and part of the Hornet Air Group, if they did fly that due westerly heading of 265, 270 degrees, based on the commander's interpretation of how we thought the Japanese carriers might be deployed, we were thinking the Japanese would not have all their carriers in the same area. They would probably have 2 to the north, 2 more to the south. Divide the forces up, make it more difficult for us to target. Well, instead, the Japanese had all 4 carriers concentrated in a relatively small area, but had they followed what we thought they were going to do, then if they had flown, again, that westerly heading of 265, 270 degrees, that would have probably put them in a position to intercept that northern carrier group, again, had the Japanese chosen to deploy their forces that way. We will continue our conversation with Dr. Timothy Orr on the Battle of Midway in just a moment. But right now, let me toss out a number, 3.6%. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, that is the current unemployment rate in the country. That certainly sounds like good news. And here's some more good news. The Department of Labor also tells us that the unemployment rate for veterans is actually a bit lower than the current national unemployment rate, the 3.6% number I tossed out there a moment ago. So good news all around, right? Well, maybe not. Here's another number, 40%. According to some research by burningglass.com, that is the unemployment rate and underemployment rate for military spouses. So while veterans are doing well, military spouses, in terms of finding a good job and developing the kind of career they want, they're not doing so well. In fact, the same research found that a significant number of military spouses have talked to their military husband, wife, partner about possibly getting out of the service so that they can have a better shot at getting a civilian job. And please understand that when you have numbers like these, it's also a national security issue. If a military family, for example, needs 2 good jobs and the spouse can't find one, well, that's going to affect them economically. It's also going to affect the military member, because he's going to be worried about the well-being of his spouse, first of all, and, of course, the economic viability of his family. Well, what can be done? Well, there are a number of programs and opportunities out there for military spouses to learn new career skills. And here at Thomas Nelson, we're indeed proud to be part of the solution. We're a part of a program called MyCAA, My Career Advancement Account. It is a program for military spouses of service members in pay grades E1 through E5, W1 and W2, and O1 and O2. MyCAA provides up to $4,000 over a 2-year period that can be used for virtually any kind of education and training program. So it's a great opportunity for military spouses, especially those of junior members, to get back in school and develop some real portable job skills. That is, skills they can use to not only get a good job locally here in the Hampton Roads area, but when it's time for that PCS move, they can then go ahead and apply those new skills and find a really good job no matter where their military spouse may go in his or her career. To learn more about MyCAA here at Thomas Nelson, contact us on the military team. Again, we've got one number now for all military students. It is 757-825-3442, or you can visit us online, tncc.edu/military, and you'll find information there on the MyCAA program. Success is closer than you think at Thomas Nelson, becoming Virginia Peninsula Community College. Let's get back to Commander Wade McCluskey a moment ago. Tell us about him. And again, on that morning of June 4th, 1942, he's leading a dive bomber formation, getting critically low on fuel. They're in the area where they think the Japanese fleet may be. How was it that at literally the last moment, as he's approaching bingo fuel, that Wade McCluskey is able to find a way to locate the Japanese fleet?
Yeah, so Wade McCluskey, in my opinion, is one of the most pivotal characters in this battle. He's a Naval Academy grad, kind of an older grad. I think he was in his early 40s at the time, from Buffalo, New York. And he had been the fighter squadron commander on Enterprise up until May of 1942, when the air group commander, Leland Young, he moves on to a shore duty. And then being the most senior squadron commander, McCluskey is bumped up to air group commander, and he's flying one of the dive bombers, because the air group commander is always assigned to a special dive bomber. So he's leading at that point just 2 squadrons. The 2 dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise, Scouting 6 and Bombing 6. And this is the group that has wasted about 50 minutes worth of fuel. And further, McCluskey is gunning it. He's ordering his men to go pedal to the metal here, cruising at about 190 knots. And normally, dive bombers cruise at about 160 knots, so they are wasting a lot of fuel. And they get to that intercept point at around 9:20, where they expect the Japanese carriers to be, and they find nothing. So his critical decision is that he decides he's going to order what's called a box search, which means turn 90 degrees and then widen your search by kind of going perpendicular to your original path, and then keep widening the search in 90 degrees. And if you had enough fuel, you would spiral outwards like a big, spirograph, right? And this works. And again, largely because he decides to go the right direction. He makes a right-hand turn as opposed to a left-hand turn, and that puts him towards the Japanese position. And right at about, 9:47 in the morning, a little bit of luck happens upon the situation, in that the group that McCluskey is leading, at that point about 32 dive bombers, they spot a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. And the Arashi is making what's called flank speed, and it is moving towards the Japanese carrier force. And what had happened was that earlier in the morning, the Arashi had been detached to deal with an American submarine that was in the area. And after dropping depth charges, it is heading back to the Japanese carrier force, trying to catch up with it to get back into formation. And it passes underneath the 2 dive bomber squadrons that McCluskey is leading. Now, McCluskey, of course, doesn't know about the Arashi being on anti-submarine patrol, but what he thinks the Arashi is, it's a liaison ship. That is, it is moving between Japanese task forces, delivering messages. So he thinks that it's going at flank speed, and it's churning up a big spray behind it, as a destroyer would, that clearly it is going to the more important fleet. So all you got to do is turn in the direction the destroyer is going and follow that to its destination. And that proved to be the right decision. Now, like, for my money, this is easily the most harrowing moment of the battle, because at that point, the dive bombers are well past their halfway point for their fuel gauge, right? And, if you imagine being one of the pilots in that mission, and you're thinking, man, we got to turn around and get back. I hope the skipper does that. But instead, he just lengthens the mission, and then lengthens the mission on this off chance of following this destroyer to possibly nothing, but maybe the Japanese fleet. If it had been me of a more cowardly stripe, I might have got on the radio and said, Skipper, maybe you want to rethink this. But not a single pilot among Enterprise's group did that. They stuck to the mission. They followed behind McCluskey, and he led them to the target. So, my hat goes off to every one of them for doing that, for being as brave as they were.
Now, we talked earlier about Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, and just a sacrificial, almost suicidal charge against the Japanese fleet. They go in there unescorted, flying low on these obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers, and as you point out, they're literally wiped out. Only one man, Ensign George Tex Gay, survives. There's always been a popular narrative about Midway that the sacrifice of Torpedo 8 actually pulled the Japanese combat air patrol, the defensive fighters flying above the fleet, pulled them down to low altitude, and that created the opening in the Japanese defenses that allowed McCluskey and the other dive bomber commanders to come in relatively unopposed and launched successful, devastating attacks on the Japanese fleet. Is that really what happened that morning?
To a degree, but it has been exaggerated. Years ago, not too far back, there was an excellent book written by two co-authors named Jonathan Parshall and Tony Tully called Shattered Sword. It's a fantastic book about the Battle of Midway, but from the Japanese perspective. And one of the things that Parshall and Tully make very clear in their book is that this is actually not what happens, that the Japanese combat air patrol are not pulled down to the level of Torpedo 8, because those planes that kill off Torpedo 8 are immediately landed and a new set of fighters put back up afterwards. There's constant shuffling of planes up and down. So if the idea was back in the 1960s when Walter Lord wrote that Torpedo 8 cleared the way for McCluskey's dive bombers, that just simply didn't happen. But what I would argue is that there was some method to the deployment of the torpedo bombers, because when they attacked, they actually delay the Japanese from launching any other airstrikes, right? Because every time they attack, the Japanese have to go into defensive formation. They have to try to avoid these torpedoes. Even though the torpedoes aren't going to do any damage because they're pathetic, the Japanese don't know that, right? So that's a lot of time that is wasted by the Japanese that allows McCluskey and his dive bombers a chance to catch up. So I think Torpedo Squadron 8 does assist the dive bomber attack later on, just not in the way that we have traditionally believed.
Now, you talk about the dive bombing technique earlier in our conversation. Again, we're talking about aircraft starting off at about 20,000 feet, plunging into a near vertical 80-degree dive. And these are not precision weapons like we have today. These are old-fashioned dumb bombs. So it's really up to the skill of the pilot, and I would say the nerve of the pilot, to maintain that vertical descent, that steep drop, until, like you said, about 1,500, 2,000 feet above the target, pickle the bomb, and then, without a G-suit, pulling back on the stick to recover and enduring, a G-force load of 6, 7, 8 Gs on you. So the skill of these men, and they're flying through thick walls of anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese carriers and their escort ships. It's incredible what they're able to achieve in that initial strike. And this is where men like the gentleman you wrote about, Dusty Cleese, come in. Talk about Dusty Cleese and how he wound up in the Battle of Midway and what he experienced in attacking the Japanese battle force.
Yeah, Dusty Cleese, a good friend of mine, subject of the book that my wife and I wrote, Never Call Me a Hero. He was one of the very last surviving aviators from the battle. So, lived until age 100 and died in 2016. So we were lucky enough that he was willing to share his story for posterity's sake. So he's a Naval Academy grad, just like McCluskey, class of 1938, a class that really experienced World War II to its fullest. They were everywhere. Kind of a Kansas farm boy is where he grew up, and just wanted to get into aviation. He was one of those guys who just was blown away by the story of Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic. And he is part of Scouting Squadron 6, the lead squadron right behind McCluskey. And his squadron goes into a dive on the carrier Kaga, one of the really big Japanese carriers. And, he's part of this big, just long line of aircraft that is going down, because the way that dive bombing works, the lead plane goes down and then every other follows it. So it's like a long trail of planes. And the idea is if the first plane misses, the next plane behind has a few seconds to make a correction. And hopefully one of those bombs is going to strike the target, right? And again, the idea here is you have to have a very low release altitude, because if you were to level bomb, by the time the bomb reaches the ocean, the ship is going to have turned and dodged out of the way. But with dive bombing, no chance for that as long as you're aiming. So when you dive, you kind of roll into the dive, and you have to sort of pick a spot on the ocean that you think the ship is going to be at the end of your dive. And it's going to be about, say, from 20,000 feet, dive will take about 56 seconds. So it's gonna seem like an eternity, but it's gonna go pretty quickly. You have the hood open, it's the cockpit, because you can't have the hood closed because of the pressure change, and to fog up because you're going from a cold altitude high up to a warm, humid altitude at the bottom. So you have to have the hood open. It means the wind is roaring about you. You can't hear anything. And then you have to kind of watch through this scope that goes right through the windshield. It's about 2 feet long. And that's how you sight the target. And you have to have your other eye on all the gauges, particularly your altimeter. And when you're dropping at 275 miles an hour, that altimeter is spinning rapidly. Woo, woo, woo. And Dusty said that they kind of learned that the altimeter doesn't spin at the right speed. So it's actually about 1,000 feet too slow. So if you're at 5,000 feet, in reality, you're at 4,000 feet. So you just got to trust that you've understood the altimeter's errors, so you can drop your bomb and pull out safely. And of course, when you drop the bomb, it kind of shudders when it drops away from the plane. If you don't drop the bomb perfectly straight, it can actually jar the whole plane like you've been hit in an automobile accident. There's one poor pilot from Scouting 6 whose his back is wrenched out after he drops his bomb because it's not straight. And then you kind of pull back on that stick. You incur those 8 G's worth of stress. And as you point out, no G suit. You might black out if you're not careful. Pull out just a few feet above the waves and just hope for the best. But the pilots from Scouting 6 and Bombing 6, they were expert at dive bombing. They had trained over and over relentlessly in the waters around Hawaii prior to the war. So they made their shots count. At least 4 bombs, probably more, go into the Kaga. 1.5 bombs go into the Akagi, and then Yorktown's dive bomber squadron happens to arrive on the same scene at the exact same moment, and they put 3 bombs into the Soryu. So in the space of about 5 minutes time, believe it or not, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers are wrecked, absolutely wrecked. And the reason that they're wrecked is because the Japanese have done a very poor job of storing their munitions on the hangar deck. So these bombs, they penetrate the flight deck, explode below, and create secondary explosions the Japanese damage control parties cannot contain. And so in just about 5 minutes, you're killing off about 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen. This is far more that are lost at Midway than the Americans had lost at Pearl Harbor.
And if I'm not mistaken, one reason the Japanese were not doing a good job storing munitions and fuel that morning, there was kind of a debate with Admiral Dagamo, who was leading the Japanese carrier force, and his staff. They had conducted, I think, an initial strike on Midway, and the leaders of the Japanese formation said, we really need to go after Midway again. So there's this debate, do we arm the aircraft for a strike on the American task forces that we know are out there somewhere? Do we go back after Midway or divide our forces and go after both? So they're trying to decide what armament to put on the aircraft for the next strike. And like you said, there are bombs unsecured, fuel hoses out there and everything. And that's when the American dive bombers arrive. And like you said, a bomb going into that kind of environment is going to create that much more damage, create secondary explosions. And basically, as you point out, it wrecked the heart of the Japanese carrier striking force. And we should talk, I think, briefly about just how important and how capable this Japanese carrier force, the Kendo Butai, really was, and what an important role it played for the Imperial Japanese Navy.
Yeah, Kendo Butai, the Japanese carrier task force, normally it's 6 carriers, but it's 4 at Midway because the 2 had been used at the Coral Sea. At Midway, it's the Kaga, the Akagi, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. And Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, they're all sunk in the morning encounter, and the Hiryu is finally sunk later in the afternoon. So 2/3 of the Japanese fleet carriers are sunk on this one day. And to put this in some perspective, the Japanese are only ever able to build 2 additional carriers during the war years, the Taiho and the Shinano. So that's all they're able to produce during the remaining years of the war. The Americans build 14 Essex-class carriers, right? So this is a valuable resource the Japanese cannot afford to lose because it's valuable to their operations. It is basically how they are able to conquer territory by using the carrier forces to soften up the beachheads or knock out any allied support units so that their army forces can go into the fray. So everything about their conquest of the Pacific is based on having a capable carrier task force. The Japanese have bought into naval air power fully. Like they're buying stock in it. And the American dive bombers, they wreck these Japanese in just a few minutes' time. And Dusty Cleese, he has the second confirmed bomb strike on the Kaga, and his bomb strike is probably the most effective because he's the first dive bomber on the Kaga to drop a 3 bomb load strike. He has a 500-pounder on his undercarriage and then 2 100-pound incendiaries on his wings. And the way that this worked was the 500-pounder struck the flight deck, went right through the Hino Maru, the big red sun on the front of the flight deck, opened up a huge hole, and then the 100-pounders were on a delay. So they bounce down into the hangar deck where they explode, creating fires, and that hits the avgas, the aviation gas, and it created this huge towering inferno, a gigantic red mushroom cloud that all the other pilots in the squadron saw. That mushroom cloud happened, it blew up maybe like 10 minutes later, but it flung Kaga's elevator some 300 feet into the air, and the mushroom cloud kept going up. And so the destruction of the Japanese carriers, again, is twofold because of the success of the dive bomber pilots' hits and then the secondary explosions from the exploding avgas and exploding ordnance that was all down in the hangar deck. So those two things combined just wiped this out. And the Japanese, I would argue, they never really recovered the naval air power to what it was prior to Midway.
And I think that's a very valid point. You mentioned a moment ago the number of fleet carriers the Japanese produced over the rest of the war. 14 Essex-class fleet carriers built by the U.S. for the U.S. Navy, along with literally dozens of smaller escort carriers. And not only that, many of the pilots who saw combat experience at Midway go back and begin training that next generation of naval aviators. The Japanese, like the Germans, for whatever reason, elected to keep their frontline pilots in combat. So those who were fished out of the water and survived Midway, many of them, instead of going back and imparting lessons to, again, new Japanese aviators, they're left in operational squadrons, and slowly but surely the process of attrition catches up with them. And so the very elite Japanese pilots and crews lost at Midway, very soon their surviving comrades also will largely meet the same fate. And therefore, when you start getting into larger engagements later in the war, the infamous Marianas Turkey Shoot comes to mind. The Japanese pilots going into those engagements are very inexperienced, very green, going up against well-trained, in many cases, veteran American pilots and crews. And, that's why it was called the turkey shoot, because we literally blasted hundreds of Japanese planes out of the sky against the loss of only a handful of American aircraft. So you're exactly right. The flower of Japanese naval aviation is lost at Midway, and the Japanese are never really able to recover. In the time we've got left, Dr. Orr, I'd like to touch on a couple of people. Well, first of all, let's get back to Dusty Cleese, because after that amazing hit on the morning of June 4th, 1942, which was really a death blow for that Japanese carrier, he wasn't done.
No, he's not. He is involved in every single combat mission that USS Enterprise is involved in at Midway. So he will go on 3 more combat missions. He goes into another attack in the afternoon that helps sink the Hiryu. On June 5th, he is involved in an operation to attack a Japanese destroyer called the Tanakaze, which is dive bombed by about 60 American SBDs, and they all miss. But then on June the 6th, he will get a 3rd hit on another Japanese ship, Makuma, which is a heavy cruiser that is finished off by the Americans. And very famously, there's a series of photographs of the wrecked Makuma taken, one of the most famous photographs of the Pacific War. Dusty gets a strike just behind the smokestack on that vessel. So he is the only American pilot, dive bomber pilot, to get 3 direct hits on Japanese vessels during the battle. It could be argued he probably killed more Japanese than any other American at that battle. And so he was a very good shot with his bombs.
And he went on to a long Navy career. I think he retired as a captain in the early 1960s, and as you point out, led a long and full life, and finally passed on in 2016, but not before sharing his story with you and your wife. And once again, I'd like you to give us the title of the book and how folks can find that.
Yeah, it's called Never Call Me a Hero, which is a quote that he often said, because he was a very modest guy. He was kind of very reluctant to even do the interview, when he kind of maybe thought that posterity's sake was more important, because what he wanted readers to remember were the men who died, right? His friends who made the ultimate sacrifice, they were the real heroes, and he was just kind of the lucky few that managed to get a hit and survive. So it is published through HarperCollins. You can just simply Google it and find booksellers who have it. It is one of the very last Battle of Midway memoirs ever written. I think it will be the last, and I would like to hope that it is the best Battle of Midway memoir written, just because it was such a fun guy to work with, and I do really miss him. He was just a character and just kind of loved life.
Sure.
So he's buried in Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas.
As we wrap up here, and we certainly, again, appreciate you taking time to appear on the podcast, let's talk about the aftermath of the battle. Obviously, the Japanese suffer a very serious, a devastating operational and strategic defeat. How is the Battle of Midway perceived in the months and days after the battle, first of all, in Japan?
Well, in Japan, you probably would not have known that there was a defeat, because the Japanese government was really putting the screws to anyone who mentioned anything about it. They did not want to admit that the defeat occurred. They wanted the public to go on thinking that Japan was still winning the war at that point. So for the Japanese, the story is mostly forgotten. Now, eventually, like when it becomes known that so many Japanese pilots and sailors are not coming back, the mask is kind of thrown off at that point. But there is not much kind of public mourning that goes on as a result of it. So back in Japan, not much at all is kind of done to recognize the defeat, and the Japanese government just simply kind of pushes ahead, thinking that it's not going to affect their overall strategic picture, though it becomes immediately obvious that it is as soon as the Americans start their invasion of the Solomon Islands in the fall. So I would say kind of one of the great tragedies is that the people of Japan really don't get a chance to kind of process the defeat, because they are not allowed to.
And on the American side, obviously we had won a great victory. How is the battle perceived in 1942, the summer of 42, here in the U.S.?
Well, papers are bursting with pride about this. The Americans were eager for some good news, and Midway was it. In fact, people were even trying to take credit for things that they didn't do. Infamously, there was the U.S. Army Air Force, which had some planes that were involved in the Battle of Midway, tried to take credit for destroying the Japanese carriers from their B-17s. And the Navy pilots hated this. In fact, there was a big brouhaha in Honolulu where some Army Air Force pilots are like, we destroyed the Japanese at Midway, and the Navy pilots are like, that's a damn lie. And so they get into a big fight that Shore Patrol has to come in and subdue. But everywhere, newspapers are touting the success of the Navy. Certainly, this is a great win for naval aviation. They already have this order for these new Essex-class carriers. It means a lot more people are going to be willing to become pilots. As dangerous as that occupation is, now one of the ways you can immediately get vengeance on Japan is to become a naval pilot, because that's what Midway has proven. If you want to destroy the Japanese Navy, you're the first line of doing that. So it really kind of gins up a lot of pride. And even there's some pride in the disastrous moments of the battle. One of the first well-known participants is Ensign George Gay, who you mentioned, the sole survivor of the TBD contingent from Torpedo Squadron 8. Life magazine writes up an article about him. And even though his story is one of him getting shot down and floating in the Pacific, the American propagandists really try to make the story of Torpedo 8's sacrifice meaningful. The Americans went in, they took it on the chin, because that is what it takes to get victory. A lot of sacrifice, and that's a thing that everyone was trying to tell people on the home front that you had to do. You had to sacrifice. You had to ration your meat, ration your rubber, your gasoline, and everything. And if you're trying to get the public to build up a common consensus about the war spirit, Midway was the perfect tool to do that. And then finally, there's even a documentary published in 1942 that wins Best Picture by a guy named John Ford, who was a filmmaker. He was on Midway Atoll when it was bombed, and he had excellent camera footage of it. And so he kind of whipped up a 20-minute little documentary about the battle, and it was seen in all these theaters, and Americans really felt a special pride. And if they felt that after Pearl Harbor and the surrender of the Philippines, the war was all but lost, they changed that. So I think emotionally, it is a dramatic turning point.
You mentioned the John Ford documentary. He also had a cameraman, part of his crew, aboard the USS Hornet, and they recorded the last film of Torpedo Squadron 8 with the pilot and his radio man posing next to their aircraft. And that was, again, the last images we saw of those men who sacrificed so heroically on the morning of June 4th, 1942. And one more note about Ford in the documentary. Ford actually, he was not only the commander of that photographic unit, which was part of the OSS, he was actually a cameraman himself, going back to his early days in Hollywood. And there's some very famous footage of the Japanese attack on Midway, and much of that was shot by John Ford and his team. And in one sequence, you will see an explosion. There appears to be something coming toward the camera. That was actually the camera manned by John Ford, and that was shrapnel. And he was actually wounded and received the Purple Heart for his actions there at Midway. A couple of more points I want to cover very briefly with you, Dr. Orr. 80 years on past Midway, what are some of the lasting lessons from your perspective that we should take from that battle all those years ago?
That is a good point. I think one of my favorite lessons is the value of the individual, right? Because this is a battle where it turns on the decisions of specific individuals involved in it, right? It's hard to imagine, right? Because, when I studied the Civil War, the key decisions are all rendered by the big generals, Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee. And these are armies of tens of thousands of men. But Midway is a battle that changes world history, and it turns on the actions of a handful of individuals. We're just talking about dozens of people, right? And the dividing line between victory and defeat was so thin that just any participant in it could kind of say that they helped change history. I think that's a nice edifying lesson to have, that we I think in a big world that is connected by the internet today, it's very easy to lose one's self and one's sense of self-worth in all the hubbub. But Midway kind of proves the point that just one good, well-meaning individual can make all the difference. So I think
Absolutely.
that's one big lesson that we definitely take away from Midway. And I think it also goes to remind us about the dangers of overconfidence, because the Japanese were the epitome of overconfidence and what they thought they could do. They were winning a whole string of victories, and they thought Midway was going to be an easy operation. And the Americans proved them dead wrong, and didn't just prove them dead wrong, but in the most destructive way possible. And I think that's something that a great many world powers ought to really think about, that just because things are going splendidly for you, you have control of everything right now, doesn't mean that you can expect it to happen that way in the future. And overconfidence can be your worst enemy in that regard. So I think those are two important lessons that the Battle of Midway teaches us today.
And one final question. We know that there has been much written in Chinese military journals, especially over the last decade, about the Battle of Midway. The Chinese military, especially the People's Liberation Army Navy, their Navy, in other words, the plan, have been reviewing the battle in great detail. What lessons do you think the Chinese draw from Midway, and how do you think that would impact their potential strategy in going into battle with the U.S. in the Pacific sometime during this century?
Oh, well, we're getting outside of my wheelhouse as a historian. I mostly deal with the past, not with the future. But, it's clear that the Chinese Navy today still sees sea power as a very potent force, right? And, having places from which you can sally forth, small bases, that gives you a greater reach into the Pacific is something that they're clearly building their naval doctrine on. So I would say that they have plenty of interest in studying Midway, because if you believe that, kind of like Alfred Thayer Mahan would say, that all the strongest, most influential nations in the world are sea powers, that's what China wants to be. And if you're studying sea power, you have to study the Battle of Midway.
Absolutely. And before we close up here, I want to point out that your wife, who is Director of Educational Programs at the Hampton Roads Naval History Museum, she's doing a presentation on Midway coming up here in early June. Would you like to promote that very briefly?
Yes, absolutely. So she's officially a part of the U.S. Navy, the civilian branch, the Naval History and Heritage Command. And she's normally found down in the Nauticus building in downtown Norfolk, was part of the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, and she is doing a Battle of Midway presentation on base for naval commands. So if anyone listens to this podcast and you wish to commemorate the Battle of Midway for your command, please contact her, because she has a vast auditorium that can be filled up with plenty of sailors, because I think it is incumbent that we teach sailors the history of their Navy, because the pride in the fleet comes first and foremost from understanding the great moments of naval history that has previously occurred, because people can't find inspiration in their own tasks today unless they are inspired by what their predecessors have done before. So a great bit of fleet camaraderie building is available. The Battle of Midway's anniversary coming up in June. And
how can folks get in touch with her to reserve tickets for that presentation coming up on the Battle of Midway? Yeah,
there's no tickets. It just as much space as it is. It's all offered free of charge. Her email is laura.l.orr@navy.mil. So if you're interested in attending her spectacular presentation on Battle of Midway, just send her an email. And if you forget that email address, just kind of Google the Hampton Roads Naval Museum and contact people there.
Okay. Dr. Orr, thank you again so much for your insight, your comments on the Battle of Midway. Again, something that we're still learning the lessons of 80 years on. We've been talking about the Battle of Midway with Dr. Timothy Orr. He's an associate professor of history at Old Dominion University in Norfolk. This has been At Ease, the military podcast of Thomas Nelson Community College. I'm Gary Pounder. Thanks for listening.